You're watching Dukascopy TV. I'm Elaine Stenson. Eurozone finance ministers have said they fully support the Irish government's decision to exit the European Union International Monetary Fund bailout without a precautionary credit line. Dublin-based economist Dr. Constantin Gurdgiev joins me on the line now. The Irish Minister for Finance, Michael Noonan, said a number of factors make exiting the bailout programme at this time favourable, including the ECB interest rate cut and that the Irish economy is now growing along with the economies of the US, the EU and the UK, while the Irish Department of Finance said confidence and sentiment towards Ireland has improved considerably. Dr. Gurdgiev, do you think that it's overly ambitious for Ireland to exit the bailout without the safety and the tough conditions of a credit line from its EU partners?
Well, I think that current risks suggest that we should be taking a precautionary line of credit from the EU and using that as a kind of, if you want, backstop to whatever risks that might materialize. The risks coming up are quite significant, and they can play out into increased funding requirement for Irish government. First of all, there are structural risks such as the cuts and reforms fatigue, something that the Irish government is certainly exposed to in terms of the political cycle. We're looking into European elections and local elections, and thereafter we're looking at the general elections within less than 2 years. In terms of the reforms fatigue, Irish government has been very slow starting the structural reforms in domestic sectors. So we still have unreformed transport system, unreformed energy systems, unreformed healthcare, unreformed education, unreformed state-controlled sectors, as well as professions such as legal profession. All of that is going to be potentially pushed off the agenda now if the Troika leaves. The other thing is we're also facing macro risks, macroeconomic risks, which are quite significant. You mentioned growth, for example. That's one of the factors. Yes, we are strongly anchored to the US and the EU growth. No, the EU is not growing, 0.1%, latest growth 0.3% before. That is certainly not something which will carry us out. More significantly, Irish growth is now deteriorating as well. If you look at exports, for example, exports of goods are down for the 9 months through September. Exports of services are still rising, but rising at slower than we expected. In terms of domestic economy, there is no restart of investment, there is no restart of consumption. Car sales are down. Across the parameters you're looking across the economy, we still see significant weaknesses there. Finally, there are funding risks which are significant as well. NTMA holds a significant cushion of funds right now, 20 to 21 billion euros. Yet 2014 requirement for funding is around 16.5 billion. That's why we have signed this precautionary deal with KfW Development Bank, the details of which were known to us. So that might be some of those backstops. And then there is banks as well. So risks are significant.
Dr. Gurdgiev, do you think that there is a stigma attached to having this credit line?
Well, I think, first of all, that the stigma attached to the traditional credit limit, to the traditional credit backstops when a country exits the IMF programs is not really present in the case of the Eurozone, simply because it is a troika rather than the IMF alone. And also, it's not necessarily a sign of weakness, but rather a sign of prudency. So I don't think that there is a real stigma attached. In addition to it, let's remember that because we are not seeking the credit backstop, we cannot qualify for the OMT, outright monetary transactions program of the ECB. And that is a very significant step for us in terms of reputational steps. So yes, we are making a bold statement to the markets. Yes, there is a positive in that statement as so far as the markets will interpret it potentially as the clarity in terms of the pricing of government bonds into the future. No, that's not really something that we can expect to play out in the short term in terms of actually giving us a boost. Nor can we expect that to be very significant in itself as an upside, because as I mentioned before, we still have some backstop in terms of the NTMA cushion, and also we have the so-called reported, but we don't know yet the details, the deal with the KfW Development Bank.
It was also confirmed that Ireland will be under surveillance by the EU and the ECB on a twice-yearly basis after it leaves the bailout, and Irish banks will soon be subject to their first stress test in more than 2 years. How do you think that they'll fare?
Well, in terms of the actual oversight, that's not surprising. We signed up to the 2-pack and 6-pack legislations quite enthusiastically, and the Irish government pushed the electorate in that direction very forcefully as well during the referendum. So as a result of that, there is nothing new that we will be still the subject to the oversight. We're losing in that oversight probably the best partner that we had before in the Troika, and that's the IMF. In terms of the bank risks, these are very significant. That goes to the heart of the macroeconomic risks that we are facing overall. I think that we will see the banks emerge with a clear bill of health from the stress test, but not to the credit to the banks, it's rather to the discredit of the stress test. The reality is banks are facing significant risks on the asset quality side, on particular mortgages and SME loans. They also are facing significant pressures in terms of their ability to raise lending margins. Their operating profits are weak, and they are not really rising significantly enough to offset for the losses which are still working their way through the books. The mortgages crisis is the most apparent there. But of course, there's, in addition to it, there's a big question as to how Irish banks will be handling exit from the LTROs, and also how they will be handling the issue of the overaccumulation, overexposure to the sovereign debt in the future as well.
Michael Noonan has also said that with over €21 billion in cash built up from periodic debt auctions during the bailout, Ireland has a sufficient buffer to make it through the next year, even if market sentiment turned. He said he did not believe there were surprises in the Irish banking system, despite criticisms from bailout monitors that Ireland has been slow to work through its mountain of bad housing debt. How do you respond to this?
Well, that is correct. Ireland has accumulated significant cushion already in NTMA balances, which is very good and very prudent thing to do. Unfortunately, those balances are somewhere around 20 to 21.5 billion. That's pretty close cut into the 16.5 billion estimated requirement for funding for the next year alone. And, obviously we can offset that, but remember, the longer we stay out of the markets, the worse signal we're sending to the markets as a result of that. So we might see, if we were to use that backstop very aggressively, if we were to cut issuance of new debt very aggressively in 2014, we might be sending a signal to the markets that we are experiencing pressures in terms of the yields and in terms of the pricing of that debt.
OK, Dr. Gurdgiev, thanks for joining me on the line today. And that's all from me for now. But do check back on Monday for more from the TV team. Have a great weekend.